Right now in the Middle East there is a new military escalation that is opening a new front in the war, while the US and Iran still cannot reach an agreement. The Yemeni Houthis have launched an offensive on several fronts at once. For the first time since 2022, large-scale fighting has erupted in the country simultaneously on multiple fronts. Moreover, the Yemeni Houthis, with support from Iran, are attacking not only government forces but also the territory of Saudi Arabia, challenging the new Saudi military alliance with Turkey and Pakistan. And this is just one part of the overall picture, because at the same time the United States has stated that it can maintain a naval blockade of Iran indefinitely. And Donald Trump insists that after defeating Iran, he will declare the Strait of Hormuz as US territory. But at this time, analysts have calculated that the world has lost 2.6 billion barrels of oil since the beginning of this war. This is the largest supply disruption in history, except for the Iranian Revolution of 1979. In this episode we will analyze both paths the conflict is taking in the Middle East. My name is Pechiy. Today is still August 14th and it's the night between the 14th and 15th. I'm recording an emergency episode because this is truly a hot topic. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We are moving towards the mark of 300,000 subscribers, so I will be grateful for each of your subscriptions. So let's start this episode with news from Yemen, as the Houthis have already launched a full-scale offensive there, reigniting the civil war in that country. Houthi units and allied tribal militias attacked the positions of pro-Saudi forces near the city of Taiz in central Yemen. The latter claimed that they repelled the attack. Meanwhile, channels associated with the Houthis state that they broke through the enemy's defenses and are advancing forward. In addition, fighting has flared up again along the contact line in Lahish province near the city of Al-Kubayta and in Mari province, specifically in the southern suburb and Harib district. So, if you know the history of the conflict, fighting has now flared up again everywhere it was frozen back in 2022, when neither side achieved the result. Almost along the entire frozen front line. And now the National Resistance Forces, these are the forces controlled by the government of Yemen, reported that the Iran-backed Houthis carried out 78 attacks on areas of the country's western coast in just one day, of which 36 were carried out with ballistic missiles and 42 with unmanned aerial vehicles. Government forces stated that the Houthi attacks did not hit any military targets. The strikes were aimed at the port of Al-Muha and civilian service facilities. The government reported that the Houthis suffered losses in manpower and ammunition on the front line and in the trenches. And the Houthis especially targeted the positions of pro-Saudi forces in the area of that very port of Al-Muha. They want to capture it in order to take control of the Red Sea coast and deprive the pro-government forces of an important advantage. Why? Because today, in fact, part of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is not under the control of the Houthis, and this port of Al-Muha opens directly into the Red Sea, closer to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And they want to finally capture it. A few days earlier, the territory of a Saudi oil refinery in Jizan, near the border with Yemen, was also shelled. Saudi Arabia carried out airstrikes against the Houthis, and pro-Saudi forces conducted artillery bombardment. And here it's important to note, what now? American President Donald Trump claims that he is moving from the hot phase of war with Iran to economic pressure, without ever opening, by the way, the Hormuz Strait. What is happening now in Yemen is the first time since 2022 that large-scale fighting has broken out between the sides in Yemen on several fronts at once. The Houthis are taking advantage of the situation, believing they have an advantage over the enemy, namely ballistic missiles and drones. And importantly, the vulnerable position of Saudi Arabia, plus the lack of reliable allies who can really help, including the United States, remaining somewhat aloof. By putting pressure on Riyadh, the Houthis hope to secure better terms for themselves in negotiations to end the war in Yemen. And Iran sees this as a tool to contain the Arabian monarchies and as additional pressure on their economies. Well, in fact, now this has also become a test of the viability of the recently formed military alliance between Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey. Let me remind you, they signed a military pact that is similar to Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That is, an attack on one is considered an attack on all. So after signing this pact, the Houthis struck Saudi Arabia. They targeted an oil refinery. Now, the civil war in Yemen has resumed. And so far, there have been no actions from Turkey or Pakistan. Overall, the scale of the escalation is confirmed by specific figures from recent weeks. Back on August 6, the Houthis announced strikes on Saudi troop positions in Hazramaut and Marib. At least 58 people were killed then. The strike, which involved ballistic missiles and drones, was a response to the alleged buildup of military forces with the support of Saudi Arabia. In a similar attack on military camps in the same provinces, at least 30 government soldiers were killed and 15 were wounded. The Houthis launched 8 missiles from Arjauf province, and the particularly heavy losses were due to the fact that in one of the camps the soldiers had just gathered for morning training. As for the port of Al-Mocha, which was attacked by the Houthis today, it remains the main target. Now, for several days, the Houthis have been attacking this port specifically, using both drones and ballistic missiles. And now the Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sariyah explained the strategic importance of this target as follows, quote, "The port of Mocha is significant due to its location on Yemen's western coast and its proximity to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most important maritime routes. But it's also important to note that a formal peace treaty between the sides in Yemen has never existed. And since March 2022, there has only been an unofficial truce in effect, if you will, a gentleman's agreement on paper. But there was no actual peace treaty. And now, essentially, even this gentleman's agreement is now a thing of the past, and the war in Yemen has truly flared up again at full strength. And in the second part, I'll give you the current picture of Iran itself, because it's directly connected to what's happening in Yemen. The Houthis and Tehran are acting with the same logic, applying simultaneous pressure on the region from several directions at once. And just recently, the US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, during his visit to Panama, stated the following, and I quote, "The US Navy can maintain such a blockade indefinitely, since we will be rotating ships as we have done so far and will continue to do." So, in other words, it's a hint that they are ready to maintain this blockade of Iran for months or even years. And later, the US Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, announced a new round of economic pressure on Iran. His quote, "Stay tuned for further announcements next week, because we will take action, the likes of which have never been seen before in the history of the economic isolation of any country." Well, you know, I noticed that at the beginning of this month, Trump said he was preparing a strike against Iran of unprecedented force. He said that nothing like this has been seen since World War II, and maybe not even during World War II. In the end, nothing happened, so that's why I'm urging you now to be skeptical about Scott Bessent's statements. He says, "We'll impose sanctions like the world has never seen. Iran will be isolated so completely that the whole world will be shocked and say like, wow. This has never happened before in history." Well, they love to say that. But that's not all yet. Here comes the climax. Donald Trump announced that after the operation against Iran is completed, he will declare the Hormuz Strait as US territory. Next is a quote from the American president. "After we finish defeating Iran, which is currently taking a very heavy beating, quite soon I will declare the Hormuz Strait as the territory of the United States." In fact, that's already the case today. We are enforcing a blockade. Not a single ship passes through unless we allow it. And according to the latest data for Thursday, in the past 24 hours, 9 ships passed through the Hormuz Strait. 5 were heading to the Persian Gulf, and 4 exited into the Gulf of Oman. I emphasize, following the route determined by Iran, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, 19 ships passed with their transponders on. Some ships are simply traveling with their transponders turned off and are not included in the statistics at all. Iran, meanwhile, continues to reject compromise options regarding the Hormuz Strait. Tehran recently rejected Oman's proposal for joint management of the strait on a 50-50 parity basis, insisting on its own option, meaning that one route should pass entirely through Iranian territorial waters so that Iran can effectively control it. Direct military losses are also continuing, and on both sides. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps shot down another American MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Hormuz Strait the day before. And according to cumulative data, the losses of American drones of this type in the conflict with Iran have exceeded 45 units, which is about 25% of their total fleet. The scale of economic losses from the entire conflict is also colossal. According to the head of Saudi Aramco, the world has lost 2.6 billion barrels of oil since the beginning of this war. This corresponds to the world's consumption for 25 days at the pre-war demand of 103 million barrels per day, and makes the current supply disruption the largest in history in terms of total volume, excluding the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Most analysts estimate the daily oil deficit on the world market at 5 million barrels, although Aramco says that 11 million barrels per day are not being delivered from the Persian Gulf. By the way, the deficit could have deepened after the Caspian pipeline operators, the consortiums, suspended oil shipments at their Black Sea terminal in Russian Novorossiysk due to attacks by Ukrainian drones. Against this backdrop, it is reported that the International Energy Agency already released 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves back in March. Of the remaining government reserves, about a third belongs to the United States of America, and the US Strategic Oil Reserve has fallen to its lowest level since January 1983. The US Government Accountability Office warned in May that a quarter of the reserve's infrastructure is already unavailable, which means that realistically no more than 100 million barrels can be released. And here's where it gets interesting, because according to experts, many Western countries already have severely limited oil reserves. Meanwhile, China, with reserves of about 1.7 billion barrels, can cover its pre-war import volume through the Hormuz Strait for almost another year. The West has reserves for half a year, so China can calmly wait out this war. In summary, the Houthis in Yemen have opened several fronts that had been frozen since 2022, counting on battles, ballistic missiles, drones, and the vulnerability of Saudi Arabia in a situation where it does not have reliable support from the US. At the same time, Iran itself continues to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, rejecting compromises with Oman, while the US responds with the promise of an indefinite blockade and unprecedented economic pressure. And against this backdrop, according to sober estimates by analysts, the world's oil reserves are only able to cover the current supply deficit by about zero. This means that the longer this double pressure on the Arabian Peninsula continues from both sides, that is, in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Hormuz Strait, the closer we get to the moment when the physical fuel reserves in global storage may simply not be enough. And then it will be necessary to accept any conditions at all, just to somehow get the oil flowing again. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.